Moosetache by Margie Plantine and illustrated by Henry Cole. To my dear, with the 5 o'clock shadow, MP. To Dan, Caroline, and Jim, with love, HC. Those were dedications. Moose had a problem. A horrible, hairy, prickly problem. It grew right below his nostrils and just above his upper lip. A moustache! Now, not a few spare hairs or shy little stubble. No mere weak, wandering whiskers on the upper lip of this moose. No series. Moose had a big, bushy, bristly, mighty moustache. But a moustache that was a blurry, slurry, mangy mess. And it itched a lot. Sure, he plucked and he tweezed. He even clipped, snipped, and teased. But his combs were still cowards. And his brushes rebelled. His scissors simply surrendered. Moose was in a fuzzy tizzy. The moustache was completely crimping his style. He was a great Hoover, but he could barely bop and hip hop with his moustache going flip flop. He was a wonderful chef, but he simply could not flambe his souffle with all those whiskers in his way. He was a darling skier, but how could he downhill race with his mighty moustache blowing in his face? Moose had to do something, and soon. But what? After days and days of much serious thought, Moose got an idea. He crossed some hair here. He crossed some hair there. And then he tied his moustache around his neck. A moose scarf seemed to be the ideal answer to his problem. It was so simple, So easy. So perfectly perfect. But then his mustache got knotted and mangled and horribly tangled. And those hundreds of hairs still pricked and tickled. Worse, Moosetache could barely take a breath with all that mustache wrapped around his neck. So Moose untied, unwrapped, and unknotted, and gulped in some fresh air. He got another idea. He parted some hair this way. He parted some hair that way. He heaped all that mustache on top of his head. Moosetache antlers seemed to be the ideal answer to his problem. It seemed so simple, so easy, so perfectly perfect. Until a squadron of squirrels and one very noisy gopher moved right in to the Moose Motel. They huddled and hoarded, surrounded and rounded out. Needless to say, became quite crowded up there in Moose's head and heavy and messy. And very, very noisy. They squirrelied, chinning and chatting, squealed and squawked, woke Moose every morning before the crack of dawn. And that gopher was giving the Moose one hairy headache. Moose needed his sleep. He needed his rest. He needed his privacy. Moosetoided antlers. Nuts, said Moose. So he unparted, unpiled, and untwisted, and untwined, and said adios to those hairy horns. But now what? What? The miserable Moose took a hold of a hunk of his hair and he rustled it. Then roped it and tethered it, tied and tamed. A moose tail! Now that's so simple. That's so easy. That was not so perfectly perfect. Talk about a dizzy do. Moose didn't know if he was coming or going. Backwards, forwards, this way, that. He didn't know which end was which. Moose had a bail on the tail. And so he thought and thought and thought more, some more. But no other idea was a worthy winner. Braids were a bother. A Moosetache sweater, too sweltering. Nest? A net? No. Poor Moose. His problem was truly terrible, unbearable, just downright sad. He felt so alone. He didn't know what else to do. Then, call it fate, call it destiny. It was probably dumb luck. But one day, Moose tripped on his Moosetache and just had no time to duck. Oomph! Pardon me, they both said as they bumped. And then they blinked. And they stared. And their hearts went thump, thump. She was a moose! A beautiful. So, bonanicious, outrageous. Well, it was just plain old big. Hair after hair piled higher and than high, a skyscraping dew of gorgeous curls. A tower of swirling twists and twirls. She was simply splendid, stupendous, absolutely superb. Of course, Moose had to ask how she did what she did to get such. Of course, Moose had to ask how she did what she did to get such a do. Miss Moose winked and then whispered, "Just a little glue." So she helped. He fiercely plunged a hoof into a fat pot of the white, gooey goop. And carefully, oh so carefully, they glooped and they plopped. They pasted and they pressed. They conicked and curled every truly unruly waveward whisker. And around they tweaked and twirled those horrible hairs until Moose's one mangy mass was now a wonderful winding wave of marvelous moustache. Moose gazed into the mirror and smiled, a broad, moosely smile. He was so happy, so glad, just giddy with glee. He looked dashing and handsome. Moose gushed. Is that really me? With not a care for one hair, the moose pair boogied and bopped. They skied downhill, even uphill. And their cooking was hot, hot, hot. So, of course, it wasn't long after that Moose and his Moosetache and his beautiful bride fox-trotted and tangoed and waltzed down the aisle. Good hair days, bad hair days. They vowed to love and to cherish, with their hearts heaped with love. Pots filled with goop. They both said, "I do," glue, and promised to never part. It was so simple, so easy, so perfect, and it stuck. The end. And you can add a picture of your own to make your own Moosetache.